The Pacific Ocean is larger than the Earth's total landmass and connects people and cultures in a unique way. The Pacific Islands, also referred to as Oceania, comprise vast terrestrial and marine ecosystems and are home to most of the world's biodiversity. Contrary to their peaceful image, the Pacific Islands are experiencing increasing social, ethnic, and political tensions and conflicts that are aggravated, if not caused, by the unfolding climate crisis, as well as the globally organized ruthless exploitation of its natural resources and the resulting disputes. The region's environmental and social challenges are numerous. Agricultural and industrial pollution, ocean acidification, overfishing, terrestrial and marine mining, deforestation, radioactivity, and hazardous waste dumping are taking their toll on ecosystems and societies. Island states are the first to suffer the effects of the climate crisis, which is already causing the loss of life and livelihoods, and is forcing residents to abandon their villages and ancestral lands. To this day, the region remains colonized and militarized. More than 1/3 of the 17 non-self-governing territories recognized by the United Nations are located in Oceania. Denied the right to determine their own political and economic future, it is difficult for many Pacific communities to develop sustainably and along their own cultural lines. Indigenous Melanesians in West Papua, East Indonesia, are exposed to discrimination and violence. Political prisoners, torture, killings by security forces, and hundreds of arrests during countless demonstrations reflect the degree of political and racial oppression. The region is a microcosm of challenges the world faces today. The Blue Continent's people and environment are already experiencing the adverse impacts brought on by the climate crisis and the ruthless exploitation of terrestrial and maritime resources. Local initiatives, churches, environmental and development organizations are building networks across Oceania and strongly demand political, economic, and environmental justice. Today, Pacific Islanders are calling for a demilitarized future for the region, with security provided not by foreign military bases, but by a strong and independent local economy centered on traditional cultures and environmental sustainability.
I hope you see my screen. And let's first start with taking a look at the map, because I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the current with the location of West Papua, and you see in the little world map where this is located. And you see the red part, of course, here is West Papua. So it's the western half of the island New Guinea. On the other half, on the eastern half, is the state Papua New Guinea. So West Papua is located north of Australia. And West Papua is divided into two provinces. We have the province Papua and the province Papua Barat, and we are calling both West Papua. So when talking about West Papua, we always meaning both provinces. So I also mentioned some keywords here in the slide, and these keywords should help you get an idea what is the conflict about in West Papua and what is the current situation in West Papua. So, of course, understanding the conflict that's going on in West Papua and understanding the human rights situation in West Papua, it's important to talk about the history of West Papua. And the history is always connected to the right to self-determination. And we will hear more about it from Ronnie, and he will give us more details about the history of West Papua. He will give us more details about what kind of actors were involved in the history of West Papua, and also how the decision how the decision was made that West Papua became a part of Indonesia. Even though the West Papuans wanted to become West Papua an independent and sovereign state itself, even though back then in the 1960s and still today. Of course, when talking about West Papua, and especially when taking a look at our work, we also have to focus on human rights violations. So it's very central here in the middle as a keyword. You see many human rights violations that are often connected to political activism in West Papua, for example, if you think about political or if you think about demonstrations or protests in West Papua, for example, protests against racism, protests against the special autonomy law, or protests against the idea of having more provinces in West Papua. Because like I said, today we have 2 provinces in West Papua, but the Indonesian government has the idea of developing up to 5 or 6 provinces in West Papua. So when there are protests against these political developments, we often see human rights violations. We see human rights violations against the freedom of speech, against the freedom of assembly. We even see against violation against the prevention of torture or violations of the right to health. So it's very multidimensional, and these are just a few human rights violations I'm going to talk about right now. I think Ronnie will mention the aspect of human rights violations more in detail in this presentation. Another aspect that's very important to know when talking about West Papua is the role of the military. And the role of the military, of course, is interconnected to the aspect of human rights violations and also to the aspect of IDPs, internally displaced people. Right now, we see an increase of both, or of all 3 of this. We've seen increase of military deployments, we've seen increase of human rights violations, and we also see an increase of IDPs in West Papua. That has to do with the fact that the Indonesian government classified the TPNPB, the OPM, it's the West Papua National Liberation Army and the Free West Papua movement, as terrorists. It was at the end of April this year. So with this terrorist classification, the Indonesian government sends more military troops to West Papua to fight against these TPNPB OPM members, especially in the highlands of West Papua. And we see there an increase of IDPs who have to flee their villages, who have to flee their homes. Yeah, and that's even though before the escalation since April and May, we had numbers of about 60,000 IDPs in West Papua, and we see thousands of more IDPs each week. Then the last aspect I would like to mention here, that's an aspect Ronnie will tell you more about, is the aspect of natural resources and land grabbing. It's an aspect you have to keep in mind when talking about West Papua, and also to understand why Indonesia has so much interest in West Papua, because West Papua is a region full of natural resources. For example, we have in West Papua the world's biggest gold and copper mine. And in the last decades, we also see, for example, an increase of palm oil plantations. So you see, West Papua is financially very attractive for national and international investments and investors. And while there is a natural exploitation and the effects of land grabbing and also the destroyment of the rainforest, the people, the Papuans feel a loss of their identity, they feel a loss of their culture and own history by these natural exploitations. So that's a very important aspect. That's important when talking about West Papua. So you see, the conflict and the situation in West Papua is very multidimensional, and I just wanted to name these few keywords here to give you an idea what the conflict is about and what the conflict or what the human rights situation is about and what we are going to talk about today. And I would like to end here and to give the floor to Ronnie Kareni, our guest. I would like to give him the chance to share more details with you and to give you the chance afterwards. He will finish with his input to ask him questions. So Ronnie, the floor is yours, and thank you very much to all of you for your attention.
Mahikai, wah. Hello and good evening, everyone. Good morning here. In the Pacific, I know there are friends as well join, especially from West Papua. A brother there, Yusuf, welcome. And I know from Fiji as well. So it's a honor to be able to share with you. And thank you, Barbara, for the introduction as well as the overview on West Papua, especially those keywords that are being already highlighted there. And given that with West Papua case, I just want to also say thank you to the organizing team here and the solidarity partners of West Papua, particularly the West Papua Network, Oceanien-Dialog, and the Pacific Desk, including International Coalition for West Papua, who have been over the years doing a lot of research and writing and updates on the situation inside West Papua. So today my focus is as highlighted in this presentation, and it focuses on West Papua, the legals, the politics, the civil resistance, and the way forward. As the PowerPoint slides will be shown very shortly. So I want to begin by highlighting in the statement made early June by Benny Wenda, leader of the United Liberation Movement for West Papua, highlighted, and I quote, "They have tried to label us separatists, armed criminal groups, and in 2019, monkeys. Now they are labeling us terrorists. This is nothing but more discrimination against the entire people of West Papua and our struggle to uphold our basic right to self-determination." So this presentation begins especially with the overview, a bit on the political context, the legal status, the civil and political force in the movement of West Papua, and also touch a bit on my role, especially through cultural diplomacy. And as you could see also in that opening there, the two beds, there were one, it's an illustration around one of the key word there around the systemic racism, looking at West Papua like, we are not even humans. And it also depicts a statement made by Benny Wenda. So into the next slide I want to give just a bit of the context around who are West Papuans. And so West Papuans, for us, we are Melanesians, the descendants of the two distinct historical races of people, the Australoids and the Austronesians. And as you could see in one of that picture there, the canoe or Melanesian outrigger canoe, and that's where I come from. If you see on the above mapping, it's the 7 groupings, tribal groupings of the indigenous Papuans, and Saireri is where I come from. It's an island just off the mainland. And then there are other 6 indigenous names that we make reference to the grouping of indigenous people. And it's mapped out through songlines and how whether the songs, whether it's the oral history, or whether it's through the sound that we follow. And as the people, that's how we identify who we are as well. With West Papua, we also make reference to freshwater people, which is from the inland highlands. As you could see there, where women in the highlands producing salt, they play a lot of role within the society, within family upbringing and the community, as well as the saltwater people. And that is where I come from and how we connect with the ocean and to our people throughout the Pacific. Next slide. So with the historical context of West Papua, it begins with as the indigenous people, but then it's the Dutch colonial influence, especially the Christianity, came to West Papua in the 1850s, and how the European Christian missionaries landed in West Papua in 1855. This year marks pretty much the 166 years of how the Christian influence in Papuan culture, and it has played a big role since then. As with over time, we it also informs the beliefs and the faith of the indigenous people of West Papua today, and especially since then, even after the Second World War, the American and Australian Baptists landed and basically carry on that the gospel news to West Papua. Even back then, with the German were in the eastern side on the northern coast of West Papua, and
Ali. Our Alpha spec number
sorry, I'm hearing something through my PowerPoint here.
6993.
Under the Indonesian, the Christian churches are centrally institutionalized within the Department of Religion, and we have seen over the years how this has informed them playing a big role, especially to address the human rights violations and the appalling conditions in West Papua. And over the years up until now, which the church has played that continuous tireless role in addressing the human rights situation on the ground. So next slide. Now, just a bit to the political context of with West Papua, as highlighted. There are historical grievances, political grievances, the human rights grievances, all underpins this West Papua case that will remain an international case that will find its, looking for a resolution within the international community. Jakarta has been arguing that it is a domestic issue, but if we see at the manner in which West Papua has been occupied or taken under a foreign government, which is by Indonesia, this presents some of the key moments within the history of West Papua where we see between the 1950s to 1960s, this is a critical point of West Papua where the West Papua, straight after the Second World War, was undergoing this roadmap of achieving full independence. And the Netherlands played a big role in preparing West Papua to achieve that dream. And so, as we see in terms of that first decade between 1950 to 1960, there were some key important events that really led to the formation of the inauguration of the New Guinea Council with representatives of the West Papua Netherlands forming an embryonic state in preparation for full independence. But as we came to also know that with the church role in West Papua comes also the interest in the wealth of the resources. And there was a finding in early 1930s by Dutch researchers and explorers, which was published in the one article in the US, and talks about the untapped land, which has the wealth of resources. And that generates the interest from the Rockefeller of Freeport and Kennedy, everyone who wanted to use the opportunity and influence the global elites to co-opt the US foreign policy in order to really have some hands-on in West Papua. So what actually happened with these dates that are highlighted here as we can see, in 1950, when there was already a resolution made by within the UN of development of self-government of West Papua, which this was made when West Papua was registered as a non-self-governing territory. So it was made under the Trusteeship Council. And this was also give the UN peacekeepers the green light to enter West Papua later in the early 60s to protect and also to prepare the one man, one vote later in that year. However, with the geopolitical and strategic interest by big players with US and the Cold War period at the time, it allows this UN dream, which if we go into the next slide. Yep. So the UN dream, which the Secretary General, Dag Hammarskjöld, was preparing a program called OPEX program, and that's a self-determination strategy program, which the UN Secretary General at the time was going around to prepare various states that are preparing them for achieving full independence. But the turnaround of this was in 61 with the UN New York Agreement. And this period between 61 till 69, this is where the legal status of West Papua, the political status of West Papua was whitewashed, was somewhat, taken over by that dream of self-determination to be achieved. And as the New York Agreement was signed off in August 1961, it is a US-driven treaty for the United Nations to administer West Papua under the UN Resolution 1752, with an option to grant Indonesia the administration until an act of self-determination. Later that year, followed into the next year, the UN General Assembly then, this was a pressure by the Indonesia. And what is interesting here is that Indonesia also at the time, it was facing later towards 65, it was going to face their confrontasi, and this was with Malaysia. So what they did was to push for a takeover of West Papua, which they've tried in the 50s up until 60s with much failure. And so in the 60s, it's to use the proxy war between the Soviets and the US to pass through this resolution, which in itself has breached, the UN has breached its obligation under the UN Charter with this resolution 2504, which didn't call on Indonesia to allow the act of self-determination, which it has agreed prior. And basically on the 1st of May, 1963, it led Indonesia to annex the region. And so this particular meeting here that took place on the 24th of April with the image of President Sukarno and Kennedy really co-opted and basically signed that agreement to hand over West Papua, and with the Dutch being forced to sign into this agreement. So the rights to self-determination of West Papua, basically this was the changing point as well in the history of West Papua to achieve that dream. And next slide. Yeah. So as I did mention, the UN dream, the UN Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld OPEX program. And this is now the question that many West Papuans up until now. We know that the UN Secretary General would have visited West Papua prior to his earlier visit to Congo. And in that still suspicious circumstances, he died during that visit. So he didn't able to continue that visit. Like this was just 10 days before his scheduled presentation of the OPEX program for West Papua to the UN General Assembly. So until now, for West Papuans that dream to achieve that right to self-determination also died with this with the UN Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld. And it remains a question for many West Papuans until today in terms of our legal and political status. And up until now, there has been a lot of research by academics to really looking at the legal status of West Papua, by which there has been a lot of the UN resolution in allowing UN to go into West Papua and for Indonesia to be able to administer the region and make reports back to the UN of the progress of the developments of the non-self-governing territory. So until now, the argument still remains that West Papua is a UN trust territory, but it requires a legal underpinning in terms of legal experts to really dig in more information around this. So next slide. Speaking of the legal status, as here highlighted here, Indonesia claim was about West Papua is based on the legal principle associated with the territorial integrity. And this claim is not a norm of international law. Indonesia did not inherit the Dutch New Guinea at the time of its independence. And at the same time as well, the sovereignty transfer agreement was auspiced by the UN Security Council in 49 directed to the status quo. And so as we see later in the 60s, the act of free choice, or the so-called act of free choice, basically was an involuntary response by, as percentage, is 0.12% of the population. And next slide. So what this really has seen, like what we're seeing now, the impacts of that since Indonesia has taken over, we're seeing West Papua has been the target of the largest transmigration program in the world. And mostly this has been funded by the World Bank, and it was badly organized and badly managed. And it has badly even damaged the unique ecosystem and permanently changed the population demographic to date. The current growth rate is 3.5%, of which only 0.2% is Papuan. Most analysts claim Melanesians will soon be a minority in their own land. And it has been researched. An academic in Australia, Jim Emsley, did a research in 2010 of the Indonesian national census. And he has concluded that this is going to be the case in the next coming decade, between 2030, 2040 onwards. West Papuans will be less and less and becoming minority, and it would West Papuans indigenous population, the demographic, would represent less than 40% of the entire population, and we're seeing this evidently already happening. As we can also see here in this, the images, many of the transmigrant settlements sit alongside commercial logging operations, as on that image lower right. And this was one of the big images taken from the National Geographic, March 2001. And Indonesia has formal regulations about the species and dimensions of tree stealth. The logging that has been happening at a greater rate is unbelievable, especially the plunder of the wealth and natural resources. I have another image here below on the left, where we see General Yudhoyono and Chancellor Merkel signed a gesture of Jakarta Declaration on the 10th of July 2012. And this declaration is an agreement to cooperate more closely in the military, whereby Yemen will supply more military equipment and rendering. And this is something we're seeing in terms of the role of military, which Barbara have highlighted in the opening, where we're seeing it's rendering activism against violations of human rights in West Papua, especially for the Papuan activists on the ground. So this is something that as citizens of Yemen and in terms of solidarity, calling for the government of Germany to relook again into their bilateral, especially the military ties with Indonesia. We're seeing in terms of the increasing deployment of security forces, and I'll discuss that a little bit later down. But this is to give us the sense around the role of Germany through the government, which is the military, the supply of military equipment. Next slide, please. And as we can see as well with West Papua, the areas of West Papua that are global ecological importance and which meant a lot to protect under Indonesian law, we're seeing that there is a lot of this flora and fauna and natural habitat are destroyed at a faster rate. And this is when we talk about the climate change, one thing that is always saddens me, and I know that in West Papua, it is joined with Papua New Guinea, as we see on the map. It is the second largest tropical rainforest, and the impacts of this deforestation and the logging companies happening at a greater rate, it means that it is impacting the monsoon system. It's also impacting in terms of the changing climate, especially with the heat that has been coming out from the surface of the earth, and it's because of the monsoon system with New Guinea, the island of New Guinea, down to Torres Strait and then into the Pacific. We're seeing that changing patterns as well within the Pacific. And so it's something to think around as well within climate change and the ecological importance, especially as we see here with butterfly. The top left is the butterfly of which it plays an important role in the ecosystem. Even the bed of the Wilson Bed of Paradise, which David Attenborough captured that in the Life of Beds, the BBC books in 1998, and as well as we can see the transmigration settlement of West Papua. Next slide, please. So in terms of what we're seeing with the current situation in West Papua is at a vintage point whereby since 2018, we are seeing an increased change in the military approach of the governance. Although Jokowi has, in its second term, we're seeing no improvement at all. Especially since the December 2018 incident at the Trans-Papua Highway up in the Nduga Regency, there has been already on record over 21,000 military deployment to West Papua. And this military deployment is carrying out 4 different operations. The first operation is to go straight to those hotspots where in the highlands region where the conflict zone is, as in Duga, as in Ilaga and Puncak Jaya, and near the Freeport McMoran mining there. Second operation is to protect all national and foreign investment companies such as the Freeport McMoran, BP, and Chevron gas, all those, and even palm oil companies. Third operation that they're deploying into West Papua is around the border patrol security. And the fourth one, this fourth operations that has been undertaken is many have not really known. It's carried out by the special elite forces, and they're calling it Nemankawi Task Force. And since the Nemankawi Task Force has been in full operation, we saw on the 9th of May the arbitrary arrest of civil resistance leader Victor Yemo, who is the spokesperson of the KNPB, the civil resistance movement in West Papua, and also spokesperson for the Papuan People's Petition, or Petisi Rakyat Papua, which currently calling for solidarity through various Papuan civil society organizations to make a strong statement against the current evaluation of the special autonomy law. And so he was arrested by this special task force called Nemankawi. And they are a combined special elite of Kostrad, Kopassus, Mobile Brigade Police, and then all the different 3 security forces, the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force. And so now they are in full operation. We also see in terms of the extrajudicial killing report here as well. On the left image, the Nemankawi Joint Security Task Force allegedly killed innocent lives, as we see in this image where a husband, wife, and another civilian. This was during a security force operation against the National Liberation Army, or TPNPB, in the Ilaga district. And this is just early this month. This incident happened. Also, we're seeing in terms of human rights violation is around the intimidation of acts of terror of journalists, and in the case of one of the West Papuan senior journalists is Victor Mambo, who has experienced intimidation of his role, and especially in West Papua, where when information is very hard to get out, and even restrictions on human rights groups and international human rights organizations cannot go in, let alone the foreign media. The local journalists on the ground are facing this on a daily basis, and as well as the forceful dispersal of any peaceful demonstrations or freedom of expression or assembly are met with forced dispersal, and often with gunshots. And usually the key prominent activists are being targeted and listed as wanted by the security forces, and that has often limited the room or the democratic space for any of the people on the ground to express the views. And so these just examples of cases that just want to highlight here around human rights violations. Next slide. And speaking of resistance on the ground, civil resistance, I just want to highlight here a little bit as well to understand more in terms of the civil resistance on the ground. while the National Liberation Army has continued to maintain their stance to protect the sacred land and protect the people. And their aim has been to have a confrontation with the Indonesian security forces. At this stage, under the international law, the war of liberation is what the National Liberation Army has been pursuing. And they have even invited the Indonesian army to go into that the battle or the war of liberation. Both sides have not really made it in terms of the Indonesian government have not acknowledged in terms of this is the national liberation, but as labeling them the movement or the Liberation Army as a terrorist organization. But one thing that I wanted to also highlight is this civil resistance, civil force, and the political force that is continuously also pushing on the streets in diplomatic and political spaces. And as you could see in terms of the civil force, the role of the customary council is very strong, and the role of women solidarity as well on the ground in West Papua, and the role of NGOs and civil society, especially the churches as well. Yesterday, the Papuan Council of Churches have released a document that also calls on the same issue around human rights, the marginalization of the voices of the indigenous people, and the suppression of the room to even speak on West Papua, just the everyday struggle, the survival. The room for meeting is closing down as well. And then we're seeing as well below is the civil society, the grassroots movement, which the KNPB has played a big role in mobilizing and organizing people on the ground. And then the Indonesia Papua Central Highlands Student Association, IMP, and they have been gaining a lot of support throughout the wider student movement in parts of Indonesia. And we're seeing coordinated efforts that are being organized together. And this is also coordinated with the Free WP or Front Rakyat Indonesia for West Papua. And these are Indonesian students, activists, young thinkers who are questioning the government militaristic approach. And so we've seen the likes of Veronica Coman, who has come out and over the years as a human rights lawyer has been advocating on the case of West Papua, especially on human rights, and also advocating on the KNPB who are activists. This has been, we're seeing that a lot here. And especially now we're seeing the movement itself has been galvanized through the Petisi Rakyat Papua. And Petisi Rakyat Papua so far now are calling, one day rejecting the evaluation of the special autonomy law, and it has garnered over 110 civil society organizations. The recent organizations that outside of West Papua and throughout Indonesia is TAPOL. It's a UK-based political prisoner advocacy group based in UK, have joined the Petisi Rakyat Papua to internationalize as well this call against the special autonomy. And Victor Yemo is the spokesperson of the Petisi Rakyat Papua. Now, on the other side of the image, as we can see, it's the political force, and this is the continuation of what has happened in '61 with the manifesto of that embryonic state with the national flag, the national anthem, and over the years it has evolved. And as now we can see in 2014, which I can, there'll be a next slide there, but I just want to show that in terms of the role of United Liberation Movement for West Papua and where it is heading towards as well to continue to bring this issue to the Pacific region within the Melanesian Spearhead Group, Pacific Island Forum, African, Caribbean, and Pacific, but also to the United Nations. We're at the UN Human Rights Council, and also looking at the legal status of West Papua is to the International Criminal Court and as well as the Commission of Jurists. Next slide, thank you. And about the United Liberation Movement for West Papua. This the United Liberation Movement for West Papua over the years has been slowly coming together when we see in terms of the lateral violence with Jakarta using the divide and conquer tactic amongst the indigenous people, the customary council grouping, and even we're seeing with the current situation with the governor of Papua province, Lucas Enembe, who is not well, and his deputy was killed last month in Jakarta. And 2 days ago, in the Home Affairs Ministry have announced a new person going to take over Lucas Enembe, the current governor of Papua province, position. And this has really created a lot more dynamics and lateral violence amongst the Papuans of why this has happened, but also towards Jakarta. And so often Jakarta looks at the weakness of the Papuans, the vulnerability, and exploit that. So the formation of United Liberation Movement is to make sure there is a representation, a coordination, as well as consultation process within the movement itself and with the civil force that I highlighted earlier to continue the aspiration, continue to advocate on the right to self-determination of the people of West Papua. So basically with the United Liberation Movement for West Papua, that culminated in the various political entities coming together. And as we know, late last year in December 2020, Benny Wenda announced the provisional government. This is in response to the current work that ULMWP is doing within the diplomatic space and the multilateral settings, such as the sub-regional grouping of Melanesian Spearhead Group, for example, where the ULMWP has a standing diplomatic ovation, and so it has to prove that to that intergovernmental body that it is also has the nation building mechanism. So that was one of those announcements. And so the role of ULMWP has basically to advocate in the political and diplomatic spaces beyond West Papua. Next slide. And now to the cultural diplomacy, and this is something that I personally have involved and passionate about, and it's through the music, using music as a weapon of choice and working with various musicians based in West Papua, in Papua New Guinea, and within the Pacific region, even here in Australia, to use music as a weapon. And it's also played that role as a conduit to unify the people, and it plays a role of cultural resistance, sustaining the identity, as well as continue the like what Papuans are, and the very thing that identifies West Papuans, and that is important. As we could see, the 2015, there was a Sorong Samurai video shooting, and then it inspired a lot of artists around the world as well to amplify that. And one of the greatest saying that we use within the arts and cultural space is that like the Tifa drum, the harder you hit us, the louder we become. And that has been the motto of many of my work, especially within the arts and music, and hoping that we continue to bring this to Europe. The work that we do with the arts and music. Here in 2012, this was one of our first tour with the one of Australia's band called Blue King Brown at the War Adelaide, and that was the moment of solidarity when we pull out the Free West Papua banner, when over 10,000 people raised their fist in the biggest public display of support for West Papuan self-determination. And that was one of the amazing things that we see that using another way to really bring the issue and addressing the situation around the human rights violation, the very situation that many Papuans on the ground have been calling for. So next slide, sorry. Yeah, so this is one that I just made reference to of the 2012 Blue King Brown at War Adelaide. So in conclusion, basically, I just wanted to highlight that the West Papua is a matter of its legal and political status. The human rights violations have been also contributed by foreign governments, especially highlighting in terms of the German, the government of German role in the military cooperation and in supplying military equipment, which are used to combat peaceful activists. And we're seeing a lot of the Indonesian police and military being trained by foreign governments. Here in Australia, we know the federal police funding, training the anti-terrorism unit. So it's good to call on the government to ask about the military ties around that. And also, the other point that I want to highlight is the how we could help in the capacity building of the Papuans on the ground, especially through the work of the journalists on the ground, through the work of the legal advocates on the ground. Because at this stage, we know that it has been very difficult for the role of journalists to give information out to the world and to let the world know about what's happening. Yes, there's been a lot of the partnership with civil society organizations in doing that, but it's also to think around how can we help to train and build strengthen the work of those who are already on the ground. That's another thought. And the last one is with the music. Yes, if any moment that the Solidarity Group in Germany wants to bring a group of musicians, Sorong Samurai, which this last slide that we will play a bit of the clip. Basically, it's a artist. We are artists from West Papua, Papua New Guinea. One is promoting our culture, the identity of who we are in this part of the region, Melanesia, and promoting that to the outside world, but with the political message of West Papua and our right to self-determination. Thank you very much for this opportunity, and hope you enjoyed this little bit of this 30-second video.
Ladies and gentlemen, how you feeling? Ladies and gentlemen, how you feeling? I can hear you, how you feeling? Here with the one talks in the house, yeah. You come to the mic and all day, yeah. Here one talks in the house, yeah. Stop Så, ja! Hela natten var sett en vardag. Hela natten var sägen raden. Så,